Is God the same as the good? Do these two terms mean the same thing? How could it possibly work to say God is the good and the good is God? When we looked at the ontological argument, we identified a maximally great being, which means he would have to be morally perfect, meaning he would not have any vices, moral imperfections, and always know the moral decision to make. However, when we looked at the ontological implications of objective moral values and duties through our form of the moral argument, we saw that these moral values and duties lead to the need for a necessary rational source, which is the good and who we call God. But how does this work? How can God be what is literal goodness and not simply just a being that is morally perfect or conforms to what is good? The first thing we need to note about objective moral values and duties is they must be grounded in something. It doesn't seem rational to say they simply exist ad hoc. For example, the laws of physics are grounded in the existence of the universe. What we call the laws of physics are simply properties of matter and descriptions of what matter naturally does in space-time. The laws of logic are descriptions of everything that exists and everything that is possible. So the laws of logic can be said to be grounded in the existence of everything. So the moral law would have to be grounded as well. However, they are very much different than the laws of logic and the laws of physics. These laws simply describe what happens, whereas the moral law prescribes what moral agents ought to do. So they cannot be grounded in the descriptions of reality, like the laws of logic are, or like the laws of physics are grounded in the physical universe. If we were to see three people, we could describe their interactions logically, but we could not deduce from the logical or physical descriptions that one ought not to kill the other two. So the moral law, which is objective prescriptions, cannot be grounded like objective descriptions are. Second, prescriptions only exist between agents. Without agents, prescriptions would not exist. As Francis J. Beckwith and Koukl said, a command only makes sense when there are two minds involved, one giving the command and one receiving it. If objective moral values and duties are prescriptions to us and not created or determined by us, then this implies they are grounded in a prescriber, a personal mind promulgating the moral law, as G.E.M. Anscombe noted. This also correlates with other arguments Peter S. Williams lays out in his paper, explaining why moral values and duties infer theism. Take moral obligations. He says, I have moral obligations, but since I can't be obligated by anything non-personal, like the evolutionary history of my species, I must be obligated by something personal. Since there are objective moral obligations that transcend all finite persons, or groups thereof, there must therefore be a transcendent personal reality to whom we are most fundamentally obligated. The point being that obligations cannot exist by themselves. Obligations exist when one agent gives one to another. You can obligate me to protect you, and that duty you prescribed would exist between us. However, if we have moral objective obligations beyond the mere human level in the existence of objective moral duties, then they would have to be grounded in a personal and rational source. As Richard Taylor said, a duty is something that is owed due, and to be obligated is, literally, to be bound. But something can be owed only to some person or persons. There can be no such thing as a duty in isolation. That is something that is owed, but owed to no person or persons. The idea of an obligation higher than this, and referred to as moral obligation, is clear enough provided reference to some lawmaker higher. But what if this higher than human lawgiver is no longer taken into account? Does the concept of moral obligation still make sense? The concept of moral obligation is unintelligible, apart from the idea of God. The words remain, but their meaning is gone. So if there are objective moral obligations or duties that we were given, and not mere human constructs, it naturally means there is a personal source of these obligations. It doesn't make sense to say the obligations simply exist without a personal source. The third way objective moral values and duties imply a necessary and personal source is the existence of the moral ideal or the concept of what is perfect. It makes sense when we say a person is morally good, but it seems incoherent to say moral goodness exists by itself as a necessary abstraction. moral goodness and moral badness seem to be properties of agents. Thus, it is far more rational if moral values and duties are properties of agents, not mere abstractions. If that is the case, and there are objective moral values and duties, it simply reasons that the moral ideal is grounded in a necessary agent that is the moral ideal. Lastly, there is the existence of moral guilt. This is not as strong as the other arguments, and I would say it only works in conjunction with the previous arguments, and if it is treated as a probabilistic argument. Beckwith argues moral guilt and shame seem to be inadequate if the moral law isn't grounded in a personal and sentient source. Why should we feel guilt towards abstract moral principles? If moral values and duties are mere abstractions, there is no reason to feel guilty when we break the moral law and did not cause harm or problems for another person. However, if there is a transcendent personal source of the moral law, then it makes sense to say we feel guilt for breaking the moral law. As Peter S. Williams says, since it would be inappropriate to feel guilt or shame before an abstract, impersonal moral principle, and since it is appropriate to feel guilt and shame before the objective moral law, that moral law cannot be an abstract moral principle. In other words, objective moral values must be ontologically grounded in a transcendent personality, before whom it is appropriate to feel moral guilt. So these arguments lead us to the conclusion moral values and duties are grounded in a rational necessary source that would have to be a mind or agent. Now some object and ask why can't moral oughts exist like other normative oughts? For example, we believe we ought to strive to be intelligent, or we believe we ought to accept the conclusion of a logically valid and sound argument. There are oughts we believe to be objectively true, and we don't infer they are prescribed by a necessary rational source. It is simply true we ought to do these things in and of themselves, as Rouchet-Furlandau argued. Not all normative laws require lawmakers. For instance, the laws of logic and rationality are normative. They tell us what we ought to do. But no one invented them. If you have excellent evidence for one claim, and this entails a second claim, then you should believe that second claim. If you are faced with contradictory propositions, and you know that one of them is false, then you must accept the other. However, the problem with saying moral oughts are the same as other normative oughts is in their status. If someone were to reject the conclusion of a valid and sound argument, we simply argue they are not being practical or reasonable. It is not the same as if to say they broke an objective law in not being rational. Williams responds to Schaeffer-Landau by saying, when Schaeffer-Landau writes that if you have excellent evidence for one claim, and this entails a second claim, then you should believe that second claim, he equivocates between moral and pragmatic senses of the word should. Logic qua logic has nothing to say about what objectively ought to be the case, morally speaking. Logic can tell us that if we want to accept whatever conclusion is validly deducible from certain premises, then such and such is the conclusion that we should accept. But this is a pragmatic if-then ought. Logic can't tell us that we have a categorical moral obligation to be reasonable or to value truth over falsehood. There is nothing morally or inherently wrong in not being practical or rational. If one doesn't accept the conclusion of a valid and sound argument, they are simply choosing not to be rational and intelligent. And although it is not a smart decision, it is not breaking an objective law for which they would be guilty of. So if we have good arguments that infer moral values and duties are grounded in a necessary rational source that would be a personal agent, let us return to our original question. How can God be the good? How does this work? How can moral goodness be a being? Should we not say all beings can be morally good, not that one being is the same as the good? Well, building on the previous arguments we gave, the evidence implies there is a personal aspect to moral values and duties. This is important to remember moving forward. We also should realize the line between abstractions and objects is often blurred in cases like this. For example, we could say your personality, will, values, and duties are grounded in you. However, if we were to remove these things from you, in reality, you would no longer be you. These things are grounded in you, but they also make you who you are essentially. In the same way, the good is grounded in God, but God is also the good. It is essential to who God is, in the same way your personality is essential to who you are. This explains why the sense of moral prescriptions, duties, obligations, values, etc. have a personal aspect to them, and how God is the good. To ask if we could take the good away from God would be as absurd as asking could you be yourself without your personality or values. And since the ontological implications of moral values and duties point to a necessary source for them to be objective, this logically means the personal necessary source, who we call God, would be unchanging. So unlike us, who can change our personalities over time, the necessary and personal source of moral values and duties would not change and would simply be. In other words, God simply is. This is why it doesn't make sense to ask could God's nature have been different. It is like asking could a bachelor be married and still be a bachelor. The essential definition of a bachelor is an unmarried male. The essential nature of the moral law infers a personal, necessary, unchanging source who we call God. To ask could God be different is as incoherent as asking could a triangle have 4 sides and still be a triangle. This is why many atheist philosophers have recognized without God there can be no objective moral values and duties. So there is nothing illogical in saying God is the good and the good is God. The very nature of the good is essentially personal, rational, and necessary, which implies an agent who would be the very being we call God.